Hey, college students. The future of our democracy urgently depends on us. You can help on-air student leaders curate trusted information on governance and elections and provide an online town square where we can all talk with politicians and each other to find common ground on issues and legislation on us.onair.cc. Our sponsors tonight are Democracy on Air, a nonpartisan nonprofit that supports the U.S. On Air network of 50 governance and election hubs, and GMU Students on Air, which oversees the GMU On Air chapter and the U.S. On Air network.
Good afternoon. My name is Frida Cervantes, and I will be your host for today's Aircast with Delegate Plum. To start off our Aircast, we produced a 1-minute video on Delegate Ken Plum's biography and his policy positions on issues based on his campaign website. Welcome, Delegate Plum. Thank you so much for joining us. How are you doing today?
I'm well, thank you, and thank you for having me. I'm looking out the window of my office at some wonderfully beautiful fall foliage. It's a beautiful time of the year.
It is. I would agree with that. I'm glad to hear that you are doing well. So to start off our Aircast, we wanted to ask a question about democracy. And one of our missions of our organization is the general promotion of democracy, particularly with college-aged voters, but the general public as well. So the first thing we wanted to ask is, how do you think the public can become more engaged in and impact our democracy?
Well, thank you very much for that discussion. It is so appropriate at this time. As the president has expressed, democracy is under attack. I grew up growing in early years interested in what we could do to make government more responsive, and have served a long time in the House of Delegates to make sure that we do have a responsive government. It has been the case that historically in Virginia, in fact, throughout the country, there have been a lot of restrictions on voting. But what we need to take a look at in Virginia now is to realize that those restrictions they're not there anymore. They don't exist. So that as a consequence, for one to be able to vote, it's as simple as registering. Registering is a simple process, and then to cast a vote. Casting a vote can be done early on. For example, voting is open now for the November 8th election. You can also send a letter back to your registrar and get an absentee ballot and vote from afar. Or on November 8th, you can go to the polls and cast a vote. The notion that somehow the process has broken down because the elections aren't fair or they're rigged or something is a terrible piece of misinformation that I hope we can, in open dialogue such as you're having here, to overcome that notion and recognize that get yourself registered once you're 18 by the voting date. And then every year in Virginia, there's an election. It's easy to cast a vote. There's no barriers between you and voting anymore in Virginia. And I want to make sure in the upcoming session of the General Assembly that we keep it that way, that we not put restrictions in place because of some misinformation that there's somehow fraud or something going on. So I'm glad to have that question because it is of concern. We used to take democracy for granted, I think, in this country, and we come to recognize you can't do that anymore. You got to be active. You got to vote.
Thank you so much for your response. Our next question would be, how would you describe the change in democracy that Virginia has recently seen?
Yeah, it's the change has occurred over the last half dozen years. In the 2020, 2021 sessions of the General Assembly, we had a unique circumstance in that both the House of Delegates and the state Senate were controlled by Democrats, and this governorship was controlled by a Democrat. It turns out that those Democrats were all progressive. And I say it that way because if you study Virginia history, you will come to realize that Virginia, while it's been a Democratic state for most of its existence, hasn't always been very progressive. But the session of 2021 and 2020 were truly progressive. And so we put in place the ways that I have mentioned already of having an easy way to register to vote. You can do it through DMV, for example. You can do it with a local registrar. You can do it by mail. But then beyond that, too, though, the ability to cast a vote is made simple by us adding to the date of election a 45-day early voting time, so that you've got all that period of time to cast a vote if you're going to be out of town or whatever. But if it turns out that you're going to be out of town and are not able to cast an early vote, you can apply for and get an absentee ballot. And in addition to allowing you to mail it in, if there was concern it might get lost in the mail, we added to the voting requirements for localities that they have drop boxes. So there are about a dozen or so places in Fairfax County where you can drop your ballot into a secure box, and it's picked up daily and held securely and counted then when the electronic votes are counted on election day. So that was, I think, the high point. Now, I have to say to you that since 2021 and in the current session, the partisan complexion of things have changed. And I don't want to make this purely a partisan discussion, but I do have to say to you that the Republican majority now in the House have made several attempts in this past legislative session to draw back on some of those advances we made in making our elections laws more progressive. I expect that we're going to see in the 2023 session, again, more attempts to limit voting. Now, of course, you have a Republican governor, a Republican House of Delegates, and a Senate that is Democratic only by one vote. So it's very close and very limiting, but I want to keep the progressive measures we put in place for the election process to stay in place, and that's going to be part of the challenge of the coming election year.
Thank you. And my last question for you is, what do you think has been one of your biggest accomplishments as a state delegate?
Well, I'll mention one that is current today that I've gotten news that we expect the second phase of the Silver Line to be open by Thanksgiving Day. As you know, the Metro Line system has an extension that goes from West Falls Church all the way into Loudoun County, passing through Reston and passing through Dulles Airport. Well, that line has not always been in existence. And in fact, the second phase is just now getting ready to open. In 1989, recognizing that transportation was going to be a major problem for people in Western Fairfax County and Loudoun County as those areas developed and as they had so much potential to develop, I organized something called the Dulles Corridor Rail Association, and we became the advocacy group to get that rail place in place. I will tell you, it's been a struggle all the time. There was a lot of people who didn't think we should fund it, that we ought to maybe have bus rapid transit. Some who thought that it wouldn't pay for itself or whatever. And so it took a long time to get the federal government involved and then get the state and local governments involved. And of course, phase one has been open now for several years, where you can take Metro Silver Line to Reston community. And this opening that's going to occur in the next couple of weeks or so will go from the Reston station near Reston Town Center all the way through Dulles Airport, and you can obviously get off at the airport, and 2 stops into Loudoun County. That will make a significant difference in the movement of the corridor. Most of you may not have been around that enough to realize that how much development has occurred over the period of time that the Silver Line operation has been underway. But anyway, that's something that happens to be really on my mind today because of this upcoming opening. In the long term, I want to say to you that I have worked since my first entry into the House of Delegates in 1978 to today to make sure that we get rid of discrimination in all forms. When I first went to the House of Delegates, the discrimination against, for example, Black people, we had just had Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1964, but Virginia drug its feet as long as it could to keep from integrating its schools. Well, that integration came about, and I worked for a number of years on trying to make that be successful and make sure that we had successfully integrated communities. Living in Reston was special to do that too, because Reston was the first integrated community. Reston developers advertised for Black folks to move into the community. Since that time, of course, we have had immigrants from all countries. And I'm delighted to say to you today that in the House of Delegates now, which had, when I went there in 1978, had essentially 90 old white men serving. And I'm happy to say now that in the House caucus, the white folks are the majority minority in that body, and that we have people from all over the world. And the House of Delegates Democratic Caucus looks like the world. We have women. As a matter of fact, there are now of the 48 members there are something like 20 women involved. That's as appropriate. But we have people also from Black, brown, and whatever. We also now, in recent years, and I've been a leader in terms of making sure that we got rid of discrimination as it relates to LGBTQ people as well. And we've had success with that. We have a transsexual member of our House of Delegates, we're proud to say. We have a couple of openly gay people in the House of Delegates. So a lot of my work has been to try to make sure that government was open and accessible to all people, regardless of their background, color, creed, who they loved, or whatever.
That's inclusivity sounds like great accomplishments as a work at the delegate. So thank you so much for that. Now we're going to open up the floor to our student panelists. Our first student is going to be Devin Pieczynski. He is a global affairs major. Devin, the floor is yours.
Perfect.
Thank you for joining us today, Delegate. My question for you is related to student loan forgiveness. President Biden recently signed legislation to forgive up to $10,000 of student loan debt. Yeah. He received a very mixed response from this. So I'm curious what your stance on student loan forgiveness is.
It is something we are absolutely way behind in terms of doing. We have not adequately funded our higher education system. And the result of that has been that students have had to borrow amounts of money to be able to successfully complete their education. Some would say, well, yeah, but that's a decision they made at that time. But an investment in higher education on the part of a student is an investment also on the part of society. We all gain by folks going to higher education programs. We all gain if people study world affairs to help us live together more compatibly around the world. With all the engineering and technology, so on that comes. So I'm an advocate for student loan forgiveness. There's some technicalities about it that still need to be worked out. They are truly technicalities, but we have to have the political will to recognize that we need to invest in our young people, both those who are going forward, having to pay tuition, but also those who have had to borrow over time to be able to get an education.
Thank you, Delegate.
So our next student is going to be Joe Kubicki, a political science major. Joe, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for being here today, Delegate. My question is rather interesting given the circumstance. You've served this state for 40 years, correct?
Correct.
And you talked about earlier your work for the DCRA and just trying to end discrimination in our state government. And so my question kind of relates to term limits and what you think about them, because you wouldn't really have had the time to do that if we had hard term limits. But on the other hand, your seat has now been held for 40 years by one person. So I wonder if you think that's
Good for democracy.
Yeah, good for democracy. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, I want to say to you, I was a political science major, also a history political science major as well, because this stuff has been of interest to me ever since I was in high school time. So, and the answer to your question, from my perspective, we have term limits in Virginia, and let me explain that. Every 2 years, I have to stand for re-election. Every 2 years, people have an opportunity to run against me. Every 2 years, voters have an opportunity to vote against me. I'm proud to say that I have, for many years, many terms, not been challenged, but that's not something I control. That's something that somebody else decides not to do to take me on. When I've had competition, I have been open to competition in terms of going to public appearances with them, participating in debates, doing all I can to make sure that people understand who I am and who my opponent is. I have had the confidence of feeling that my values represent the values of my district. If people decided that I have served too long, they'll turn me out. That'll be the term limit. So to arbitrarily say that you should be able to run only for 4, 6, 8, whatever the number is that you choose, it does bring a value, I suppose, in having some new blood show up. But at the same time, it limits those folks who have a lifelong dedication to the effort and convince voters that my values represent the values of the district. I want to say to you, too, that while I've been there for more than 40 years, I'm a progressive legislator. I'm more progressive than many of the new people who are there. As a matter of fact, about a fourth of the members who are now in the legislature in the House of Delegates weren't born when I first went to the legislature. And that's by the way that the voters had made those choices. What I'm pleased to say, too, and when we talk about early advances that I think I've made, I was an advocate of nonpartisan legislative redistricting. And I introduced a bill in 1982 to set up a nonpartisan legislative process because I thought the gerrymandering was and is truly undemocratic and unfair. It took until 2019, I think it was, that we finally passed a bill, or 2020, I guess it was, that we passed a bill for nonpartisan legislative redistricting. So I have tried to be fair and square about the thing, and there's no secret to the fact I've been around a long time. A whole lot of people know me because I've been around a long time, and I think a whole lot of people know my values and so on. So when you decide it's time for the limits up for Plum, I won't go back again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Up next, we have Ben Murphy, who is also a political science major.
Okay.
Hi, Delegate. Thanks for joining us.
Sure.
I have 2 questions for you today. My first one has to do with state governments. From my understanding, they're generally more effective at legislating than Congress, partially because of the imposed time limits on many of them. It forces a decrease in polarization and it forces compromise. And I was wondering, is that your experience working as a state legislature, that you find yourself coming to compromises and trying to work to decrease polarization across the aisle?
I wish that were true. And there have been times, certainly over the decades that I've been there, where it's true that you get a mix of people who are compromise oriented. I will tell you that in more recent years, it seems that there's a greater polarization generally because most every subject is dealt with as a partisan issue. And that candidly is a concern to me because there are a whole lot of things that we deal with that I don't think have a Democratic or a Republican side to them. I think there's things that are good for government. And so I believe in compromise. I will tell you, it's hard to get compromise these days because as partisans, what happens with a partisanship is that you will have on both sides, Democrat and Republican, you will have leadership that will require its members to vote with the caucus. I have on occasion, and in fact, when I mentioned the bill to overcome legislative gerrymandering, I broke with the Democratic caucus, who was opposed to the measure, and I was for the measure. And along with me were about 11 other Democrats who broke with the caucus. That brought about a compromise that I think is good for Virginia. So the Congress, I just have no should I say, understanding sometimes as to how it is that they are set such loggerheads all the time. I wish I could say that's not true in Virginia. It is true from time to time. The difference in Virginia is that since we meet for such a short period of time, if we can't agree, we put it off. And so as a consequence, you have lingering problems that should have been dealt with years ago, and they're still with us. And so where we are in Virginia, of course, is we consider ourselves citizen legislators because I live in Reston longer than I live in Richmond. The legislative session and the even years is a 60-day session. That's 60 calendar days, not 60 business days. So that I'm there from early January into early March. We have during that period of time 2,500 or so pieces of legislation to deal with. Now you divide 60 into 2,500 and you know how fast we must work. The consequence of that is that the issue is so difficult, sometimes it gets set aside. And so sometimes you'll look at some measure that finally passes and you'll realize, oh my gosh, that gerrymandering he was talking about, he introduced the bill in 1982 and it passed in a bill like it passed in 2020. So the Congress, because it's there all the time, doesn't use that method very often. What we do also do in the state legislature that's sometimes helpful and sometimes delaying is that we'll do a study. When we're there, and of course, virtually everybody there has another occupation. Overlapping with my service in the legislature was my career of 30 years working for Fairfax County Public Schools. So I was a part-time citizen legislator. It turns out now I'm advantaged by the fact that I'm retired, so I'm a time and a half full-time legislator. And I'm not complaining about that. That's by my choice and something I enjoy doing. But the other side of the short term is you oftentimes don't have an opportunity to work through. And so sometimes the partisanship overrides the time and we don't take action on matters that we need to take.
Very insightful. Thank you. My second question also has to do with democracy to some capacity. As I'm sure we're all aware, the levels of government that have the most effect on your average voter are obviously going to be state and local level politics, but most people are generally interested in like the presidential election, and that's kind of it. So I was wondering, from your perspective, is there anything that we can do to start convincing people that maybe they should be focusing their attention on state and local level politics over national level?
Yeah, and that's it's partly a function, I think, of the availability of the news. Obviously, you turn on the television and you hear about the national stuff, and a lot more money is spent on national elections and that sort of thing. What I've tried to do to overcome that is that I do a weekly newsletter that you can subscribe to for free. If you go to kenplum.com, that's my website, click on subscribe, and every Wednesday morning at 6 a.m., you'll get a newsletter from me. And the newsletter will consist of two things. It'll consist of commentary, where I tell you what I think about most recent issues or what's going on. And secondly, it's filled with information about where you can offer public comment on legislation, where you can go to public hearings, what's going on in the community. So as a legislator, I've tried to, in part, fill that void of lack of information on the part of state government, because if you read the Washington Post, you don't read much about Virginia government, and the local papers have no opportunity to cover that. Fairfax County itself, being a rich county, it has a little more opportunity to gain notice, but you're correct in your observation that the local folks get a lot more coverage than do state folks. But if you start taking a look at issues that might interest you, you might be surprised to realize that, gee whiz, I could work on that in Fairfax, or I could work on that in Richmond. Don't necessarily have to go to Washington, D.C.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Our last student is Ani Prakash, who is a global affairs major. Ani, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for being here, Delegate. So my question for you today pertains to both climate and conservation. So the Biden administration passed or advanced a commitment that worked to create more equitable access to parks and nature and communities. And this is in accordance to the Inflation Reduction Act. And from looking at your website, it shows that you have received so much recognition on conservation and environmental preservation per se. So my question to you is, what can the people of Reston area and Fairfax area and within the entire Virginia Commonwealth do more towards promoting better conservation and further environmental preservation within their communities?
It's a good question, and I will tell you it's one that I hope you will help me think about over time as to what we can get folks to do. I am a conservationist by nature, by personal beliefs. This afternoon, I will go to a reception with the legal conservation voters. Those are the people who have climate change and so on as high priority. And tomorrow afternoon, I will go to a session recognizing those people who've been environmental leaders in Virginia. So the environment is of great concern to me. We were away on the weekend, and when we came back, the same way we always come back, part of our suitcase is filled with aluminum cans and the plastic water bottles and all that sort of stuff, because we feel a personal obligation. My yard outside is filled with native plants, not with other plants. We do not fertilize, we use compost. So what happens, what I'm trying to say is that for me, there's a personal part of this that says that I have to be a good conservationist. And I think we want to have people come to understand that we all individually play a role. Beyond that, and of course, we individually can't solve this, but we can make a contribution to it. And we ought to work ways in which we can get the public involved in these things so that they can play a role. But beyond that, then we have to work on the business side as well as the government side to adopt practices and adopt regulations such that we, and particularly in the European countries, we adopt regulations such that we recognize that your business is going to impact us all because it impacts the environment. And heavens knows, when you look back in time, you don't have to look back very far to realize that there have been business enterprises that gave a locality some jobs, but when the business went out of business, you realize the land was no longer usable because it was so poisoned with the Superfund sites and all. So it's a individual responsibility from my perspective, doing what we can as individuals, but then recognizing that in our community, through our homeowner associations or with our neighborhoods, adopt good environmental practices, and then recognize that it's a state and federal level. It turns out that the Shadow National Park, which is so beautiful now in Virginia, has been adversely affected over the years by the bad air that blows in from the Ohio Valley and the manufacturing companies there. It makes us realize that we are interdependent to recognize that your economic gain might be my environmental loss. So that's why some of these issues turn out to have to be dealt with on the federal level. The other thing I will tell you is I'm a big advocate for electric vehicles. I happen to own a Tesla and drive a Tesla and do all I can to promote the use of electric vehicles, because automobile and vehicle exhaust are one of the big contributors to our pollution. And it's something that we come to recognize. Engineers have figured out how to make a wonderful vehicle. I happen to drive a Tesla, but now most every manufacturer is turning to building those. And we just have approved a major EV charging system for the interstate highways throughout Virginia. The notion that somehow you can run out of electricity or whatever, once you get one and understand how all that works, it's not an issue, not a problem. So anyway, make a long story short, I think we each have a personal responsibility, but then we have to recognize that we can do some things at the state level, but a lot of those things don't relate to state boundaries. They relate to national issues. So we need to continue to press for action on the part of the Congress and do what we can to make sure that legislators aren't unduly influenced by big business interests that might be working adversely to our interests. So if you get a reputation as a business as being a polluter, when I make my investments, I don't invest in your business. And we can all adopt that kind of philosophy to try to bring about change. So that's a rambling long story to a complex issue. But as you all develop ideas and so on as to how we might be more friendly to our environment, I'd be pleased to have your suggestions and ideas, because it's an open topic that doesn't have a simple answer, but has many answers, and we need to know what all those are.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mason students, for your participation today. Does anyone have any final thoughts?
Just thank you for joining us. Really insightful answers, so I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yes,
Well, thank you all as well. I am delighted to have this conversation, and it's too bad we don't have more opportunities to do these sorts of things, because using media is a way, and I am the father of the Joint Commission on Technology and Science in the House of Delegates, and I have maintained all along that technology is one of the enablers of democracy, and that's what we started off talking about. And we're using technology to show up today how it is that technology can advance democracy. So thank you all for having me.
of course, it is our pleasure to have you. And I would also like to echo that about technology being an enabler for democracy. And that concludes our Aircast. Thanks again, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You can learn more about the US On Air network by going to us.onair.cc and select one of the About posts. You can find a video recording of this Aircast in our US and Virginia On Air YouTube channels and in VA On Air posts.